Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I know I've kind of been out on Defender Fridays for a little bit, just with all the DEF CON, Black Hat, and chaos that comes with that. So huge appreciation for Matt Bromley, my other co-host, for stepping in and holding down the show. But I am back, and couldn't be more excited to be back for this particular episode because today's guest is a really good friend of mine, a colleague I've worked with for well over a decade. But real quick, just to level set, just in case there's any new faces here, Defender Fridays, right? What's it about? So the idea here is to have a very brief, informal, fireside-like chat once a week on Friday, 12:30, Central Time, to just bring together like-minded people in InfoSec, right? Yes, it's Defender Fridays, but really that just means anything to do with information security because offense informs defense and all that fun stuff, as you all already know. But it's to bring us together, not only to hear from industry experts like today, we've got Marcus Guevara on, but also to collaborate with one another. This isn't a unicast presentation from one person speaking to many, but we try to really foster sort of that collaborative feel of folks asking questions, contributing their thoughts, and really kind of continue to build and foster this community, which I got to say, I'm so thrilled to see what this thing has become. I think we're coming up on a year of running this. I can't remember the exact start date, but we're close to it. Maybe in another month or two, we'll probably hit the 1 year mark for Defender Fridays. So I just want to first just share appreciation to all of you who continue to show up every Friday and hang out with us for this half hour. But without further ado, again, I'm very, very excited to announce our guest today. Marcus Guevara is not only an industry expert in a lot of cool fields such as incident response, security operations. He's got some really cool background. Marcus and I go way back. We actually served together in the Air Force in cyber warfare operations before he committed an act of treason and left the Air Force to join the Coast Guard. Went up to the DC area and actually built and ran the first SOC for the Coast Guard. And forgive me, Marcus, you probably have additional color commentary, but as I understand, you were basically partnered closely with DHS at the time. And also supporting the Department of Homeland Security and their incident response team that would go out and respond to like nuclear reactors and all kinds of really cool stuff like that, right? But then also, for those of you that don't know, Marcus is also a SANS instructor, digital forensics incident response. So he just brings not only a wealth of knowledge and a lot of really cool experience, but I just got to say he's also probably one of the most well-rounded stand-up humans that I have the pleasure to know. So Marcus, thank you for making the time to join us today, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So I always, it's hard for me to think like, first of all, Eric and I, we took some of our first classes together, like CEH, Linux Plus and stuff like that. So it's amazing and it's cool to see just like how far we've come after many, many years of just like the different paths that we've taken. But ultimately, like it's for me, I struggle with expert because like I know there's so many things that I don't know. And one of the reasons I like being on these kinds of things, even as a guest, is because I get an opportunity to come and learn from others, right? Like sometimes I look at you guys, the things that you, Eric and Whitney are doing and others, and I'm like, it's profound to me because these are things that, like there are areas that I am good. And then there's areas that I'm like shaky and there's areas like, I don't really know that stuff. So one of the goals that I have for today is to share some of the things that I have insights in, but I would love to invite other people to share their insights because there are areas where I'm sure that you guys know more than me and maybe some of these particular components. But hey, do I have the opportunity to share? I don't. Can you?
Yeah, I can make you a host here.
There's the wild Jeff.
With great power comes great responsibility. And while you're setting up to share whatever you're going to share, Marcus, I want to just say something real quick. It's the humility that you just kind of brought forward that gives me the confidence to call you an expert, because like you, I would never refer to myself as an expert, because that's, I think, where you sort of cross a threshold of, oh, I think I know everything, therefore the reality is probably the inverse. But it's the humility and sort of that open-mindedness to know that there's so much I don't know, right? Yeah, I've got deep experience in several facets of this, but like there's still so much I don't know. And the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And I think that's where you kind of cross that threshold of, okay, at least you're sort of always in constant pursuit of knowledge. And I'm not saying this to build up Marcus. I'm saying this hopes that it kind of permeates across, the group
That's
here.
right.
That like
there's other people that could probably guess something. You don't have to know everything about a thing in order to come on and share something, right? I guess is what you're saying. Especially because if you're humble enough to recognize that, like, guys, like right, like I'm not going to act like I know everything about this, then it invites other people to help you and support you. So I'm sure that Jeff's probably going to come in and say, something fantastic at some point, right? So anyway, yeah, for sure. All right, let me share something real quick. Sorry, I'm watching Eric's face.
I'm sorry. Slide 1 of 50. Marcus,
Okay,
I'm about
I'm
to
just
boot you.
I think you told me to bring a bunch of slides. I thought you said, oh, wait, you said don't share a bunch of slides. My bad. So
I'm now rethinking every Friday.
that's right. All right, just so you know, they're all fake slides, but there are some funny little things in there that I took some time to like actually create some fake slides. But all right, I'm sorry. I'll stop.
Shame on you.
I know. I thought you might enjoy it though. All right.
All right. Okay. Now that I see what you were getting at, okay. Well done.
It was only because you know that I know how these things go, but
that's right.
Felt like
I should have given you the benefit of the doubt.
It's all good, dude. But check this out. I do actually want to share something that I think will be helpful for just kind of tracking the thought process here. So it's not a set of slides. It's just a thing that helps me to kind of visualize some of the components of the things that I want to talk about, so that because this is one of the most processes, man, like to me are one of the weirdest and most difficult things to like talk about without some kind of visual. But the reason why I thought this would be a good topic is because when I teach 508, one of the things that I recognize as a pattern of kind of an issue in people's understanding of like trying to track down malware and do analysis as security analysts in a SOC, or even when they're doing memory forensics, because a lot of people aren't even exposed that well to memory forensics unless that is their thing in law enforcement, for example. But SOC analysts struggle with that because they don't get a lot of opportunity to play with it. And one of the things that I see very often as a common misunderstanding is the difference between processes and executables, because they share the same name, right? Like you have an executable and then you have a process, and they're both named svchost.exe, and people mistakenly think that they're the same thing. And that leads to a lot of weird, like, and bad conclusions, essentially, right? Like, let's say, for example, go ahead.
Marcus, I literally just had a conversation with somebody the other day about this same confusion, because what they were observing was that, say they launched an executable from the disk, it's called abc.exe, and now it's running in memory, abc.exe, and then they renamed the binary on the disk. They were confused as to why the process running in memory was still the original name.
Right. Or similarly, you might have somebody get an alert that fires on a process that's doing something malicious, and then they go take the executable file and like upload it to VirusTotal and find out there's nothing wrong with it or whatever, right? Like their bad understanding of the differences between a process and executable can sometimes lead to bad analysis. And they might say, you know what, this actually is totally cool, right? Like the executable it's signed by Microsoft. There's no way that this thing is actual malware. And then they don't recognize that it's the process that got attacked, not the executable. So like a very simple way to understand it, for me at least, is that an executable is kind of like a recipe. It's just a piece of paper with a bunch of instructions on it, right? Like it doesn't do anything by itself. A recipe has all these instructions, and it even calls for other things that it's going to need, but a recipe doesn't make anything, right? So when somebody, let's say, double clicks an executable, what happens is that Windows will instantiate a brand new process. And a process is composed of many different things, including the executable, right? So, again, you think about like the person who's going to make the cake or whatever has to have the recipe. So they'll take the recipe, but then they got to go get all the other ingredients, like the sugar and the whatever you use to make a cake. I usually just buy the ice cream cakes because they're the best. But the process is kind of like that, right? A process is going to suck up the executable along with other things that it's going to need, like DLLs. It's going to have references to files and other things that it's going to need. So the idea is that a process is a much bigger component than just the executable. And so there's a couple of components, and this is kind of rough, right? Because I'm trying not to overwhelm people here, but there's a couple of different structures, data structures that make up a process. So the E process is going to, this is basically information about the process. This is where your like process ID and various other things are. And these E process blocks are actually what get chained together so that the operating system knows what processes are running, right? So when you go and list out your processes, it's going to go look at that list, and it's going to, it can run through that list either forward or backward. It's a doubly linked list. That's how we know what's running on the system. Your process environment block is where your references to the DLLs and the executable are that end up getting loaded. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because what I want to do is I want to demonstrate or talk about some of the attacks that occur, and then how an analyst can use knowledge about how these things are structured in order to look for certain things that we know will be, indicators of malicious activity, right? And remember, we're not talking at all about the executable code, the original executable code, because the original executable code can actually be a normal and legitimate even Windows binary, right? So the process environment block has a pointer to these lists that load or that track the loading of DLLs for different reasons. And sometimes I actually do know the reasons for these different lists. I don't know exactly how they're used and all the things. And by the way, just for reference, anytime that my life has been really exciting lately, because, and I don't mean it necessarily in a good way. I mean, I've been traveling a bunch. I'm doing all these things in the house. Like, my life has been exciting. I'm exhausted. So whenever it gets too exciting, I grab this book right here. Oh man, you can't see it. It's called Windows Internals by Mark Rusinovich and some others. It's a good book, but it's one of those ones that let's just say you got to like watching paint dry if you're looking for something exciting to do. But anyway, these different lists here will actually track the DLLs and the executables that are loaded up. And so that kind of brings me to the first idea of the different attacks that we might. And by the way, Eric, jump in at any point if there's something that I'm either missing, because I'm trying to fit this in 30 minutes.
Yeah, you're on fire, man. Love it.
Okay, so check this out. The PEB, or that process environment block, is going to track all those DLLs that get loaded. Remember, these DLLs are being loaded into the process. This hasn't. They're being called by the executable. They're not the same thing as the executable, right? The process is loading up these DLLs. And so one of the attacks that you might have is simply loading a malicious DLL into the process, right? This is, again, not the executable. If you go look at the executable and you break that thing down or put in a virus total, this executable might fool you into thinking everything's okay, because the problem isn't in the executable. It's not the recipe. It's that somebody substituted sugar for salt. You know what I mean? So like if I labeled the sugar canister with the salt canister with sugar, it looks the same. And actually my kids have done that before. They've actually made us some like cookies or something with salt. Dude, it was horrible. Go ahead, jump in.
And to kind of build on that example, I love that analogy, by the way. To build on that example, not only could it be that somebody mislabeled, like they stuck a sugar label on a salt, can. What if the recipe calls for sugar, but maybe there's no sugar in the kitchen at all, and the recipe's like, oh, it's not there. Okay, no problem. Keep baking. But then somebody comes along and puts the sugar there, right? Like a phantom hijack, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So actually, I didn't highlight that, but that's another great one that. So let me just write that down. So.
Yeah, I feel like for this analogy, it's kind of like the cook always looks to the same pot, and if you swap out the sugar for salt, you're going to have a bad time.
Yeah. It's an optional ingredient, right? Load it if it's there, skip it if it's not. But an attacker could take advantage of that missing condition.
Right. Yeah. So a search order hijacking would be you putting the sugar closer to them, right? So that when they turn to look for the sugar, they're like, oh, it's right here. Why would I go all the way to the pantry? It's right here on the counter, right? So search order hijacking is throwing it right there next to them. And then phantom hijacking would be where the sugar is essentially gone, and you're effectively taking something else and throwing it into that place so that they will find it, even though technically it never would have been found and it would have been okay, right? Well, depending on what the recipe is for, sometimes no sugar is okay. Sometimes that's a major sin. But anyway, so that would be, this takes advantage of classic DLL injection, which is actually a normal thing, right? You know this. The DLLs are injected all the time. That's totally normal. This is actually all done from just Windows API calls. It's not even, right? Like there's nothing malicious about the way in which it's happening. It's just the fact that you're handing something malicious to a legitimate process, which would actually be different than injecting code directly from memory and actually going around the way that Windows wants you to inject code, right? Because Windows wants you to place a file. And if you say instead, well, how about instead of be giving you a file, what if I just gave you the code and I just kind of like push it in there, right? So that kind of PE injection is something that is an anomaly in and of itself. Actually, I didn't think of a good analogy for how that like
reflective injection.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. Good.
Yeah. No, let's build. I'm such a fan of this like cooking analogy that I'm going to steal it, by the way.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I've already thought it through. So with the simple DLL injection, the classic methods, right? Let's say there's a rule that must always be followed, and it's that before an ingredient can be added to this thing we're making, the ingredient must be sourced from the countertop or the pantry, right? Like that's a limitation of the classic or simple DLL injection, that if the threat actor wants to sneak in some bad code, they have to follow the rule of putting that bad code on the countertop. But the problem with that is the countertop has forensics on it, right? Like if I put my code on that countertop, right, it's easily discovered, versus with what Marcus is about to go into with more advanced injection techniques, like reflective code injection, you can skip the countertop altogether. Windows requires the use of the countertop unless you basically bypass the Windows APIs, bring your own injection capability. So it would be like, instead of me having to put the ingredient on the countertop, I just snuck in the kitchen window, poured the sugar directly into your recipe and left. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Or like maybe you hand it to your kid and you're like, hey, go take that to mom and tell her to toss this in there or something like that. I don't know if you wanted to, for whatever reason, destroy it and have your kid get the blame. But that's actually, I like that. I like that idea of like just basically coming in through the window and throwing it in there. So what happens though is that this produces a weird anomaly because Windows does expect that this is all going to come from, or that code that's being loaded into a running process is going to come from a file. And so I have a screenshot here. I'm running this right now. I'm a little nervous about switching screens back and forth because I saw last time that you were doing that.
No, that was because of a multi
on your side.
Setup. Yeah, that was on me.
In any case, so effectively, this is just output from malfind. I know that you're familiar with this. Some of you guys probably are very familiar, but malfind, what it's going to do, it's going to go look at the memory sections that are owned by the process. It's going to look for sections that have essentially the permissions to execute code. Then it's going to look to make sure that, or to find any memory sections that are not backed by a file on disk. So what you just mentioned is it's going to look for anything that effectively doesn't have reference to where it came from on the counter, right? Like if I say, hey, there's some sugar in my, or whatever, there's something in my recipe, like, and I turn around to all my family, I'm like, where did this come from? And they're like, I don't know, like, right? Like there's no like containers for sugar in the pantry or on the right. I'm like, but what is this white powder right here? Because clearly it came from somewhere, right? That idea is essentially what malfind is looking for. It's looking for things that are there, but don't look like they came from a location that is legitimate or that it's supposed to be, right? So anyway, this is what malfind is going to produce for you, which is going to show you things like this process, which happens to have an MZ header in there, which everybody knows that's Mark Zuckerberg's signature. And that, I'm kidding. I always say that in class, and dude, nobody ever laughs because it just floors me. Like nobody knows that that's a joke. Okay, so thank you, Jeff, because I can see you laughing over there. So the MZ header for the is essentially saying this is portable executable, a portable executable format, right? So we know that there is actually code in this section of lsas.exe, and lsas, sorry, and we already also know that this is also in a memory location that's owned by the process, but not backed by a file on disk. So it's extremely suspicious.
So there's a recipe in the pot that we have no trace of anywhere else in the kitchen. Yeah.
I can definitely see it in there.
Let me abandon the analogy for a moment and say,
please.
hey, you could look through process memory of each of the processes and attempt to find where the code came from. And any code that is not backed by an executable or a DLL on disk is worthy of further investigation. My favorite type of signature is not, this is known bad. It's just, hey, this is really unusual and worthy of further investigation. That's essentially what Malphite is doing. We can analogize it, but that's kind of the source of truth there.
That's a good point, because you can have false positives here, right? Like you can have a memory section that just has the read, write, execute permissions, but it doesn't actually have code there. So just because Malphite shows it, right? Like Jeff is talking about actually doing the work of let's make sure, right? And at this point, I would say that like for most of us guys in incident response, this is where we might have a Jeff or somebody who has a little bit more reverse engineering knowledge to come in and take it to that next level of like, disassembling the code and all that kind of stuff, right? So this gets me though now to another idea of something called process hollowing. And the idea of process hollowing is that you can, and by the way, I'm going to throw this, I'll throw it at the end. There's a couple of different links that I want to throw, but I found this cool video. It's only like a few minutes long of walking through actually performing process hollowing. But essentially what you do is you start up a process and you start it up with in a suspended state, right? You then go and you carve out the executable and you replace it with your own malicious stuff, right? And then you resume it, and effectively what you have is the shell of the process with your own malware that's now in there, right?
Yo.
Go ahead. Do you have the analogy? Go.
Yeah, you got to, man. All right. So what you're saying is, it'd be like, I'm in my kitchen cooking a meal, and you somehow freeze me in time, walk into my kitchen, dump out my meal from the pot, replace it with the contents of your meal, and I'm none the wiser. I continue cooking, not realizing the contents of my meal have been replaced.
Yeah, either that or like if I waited till you turned around and I replaced the recipe with one that looked exactly like it, but actually called for different ingredients or in an incorrect order so that it would get screwed up, right? So either way, right, like I'm literally carving out something that is you expected is normal because you went and got the recipe from your recipe book that you have locked, right? You have it locked away in some, I don't know, Eric's special recipes. He was just telling me about some.
I have one of these, by the way.
Do you? Okay. So you know that you got it from a source that you trust. It's from your recipe thing book, whatever, right? And then I come in and I change it after you've already started the process. And now you don't know that the recipe's actually changed because you don't have it memorized or whatever, right? But anyway, that's essentially what process hollowing is. So when you perform process hollowing, you're going to get something like this, which is, and I'll actually let anybody else who wants to jump in and show me. Let me just describe really quickly what this is. This is showing us the loaded up DLLs and the executable in a process. So all of this is for lsas.exe. It's one process. I know there's a bunch of different lines in here, but it's all for one process. You can see that they're all the same process ID, 1928. And loader modules is a volatility plugin that's going to basically show us all the DLLs that are loaded. And each of these lists that track the DLLs and the executable, it's going to tell us if it's found there or not found there, right? So does anybody see something though that's like super clear, like kind of odd? One of these is not like the others. Yeah.
Well, there's a few answers to that question.
There's 2 unmapped paths.
Yes, and one of those unmapped paths is actually a very well-known location of something that we would expect to be there.
So before you say what it is, let me go back to this over here. So we were talking about the PEB, the process environment block, right?
Yes.
You're talking about these 3 different lists here, where 2 of these lists actually they have the executable. And Dude, you said abc.exe as an example, and it just turned
Oh,
out to be
man.
that I had an example
minds.
of abc.exe. Exactly. So
Great minds. So what you're saying is, so we expect that all DLLs loaded will be contained in all three of these lists. However, the exe is also considered to be an image that is loaded, similar to a DLL, but it's only contained in two of the lists, not all of them, right?
Exactly. Right. So exactly. So you can see this in this initialization order doesn't contain that executable.
Right.
But the other two do, but they all have that DLL path, right? So they all are supposed to have that. So then if we go back over here, as you were pointing out, we have inside of this the loader module's output, we have, first of all, I think Ryan was the guy that came out and said that these two are completely missing. There should be something here. So we would expect like a DLL to be here, for example, but you're pointing out that in these lists, which it's not lined up correctly, right? But this is the load, this is the init, and this is the inmem. You have a true, false, true right here, which means that right here in this first one, I would expect the path to lsas.exe.
Well, and there's one other reason for that, right? It's that base address as well.
Right, executables have a base exactly. So
0x1 is the relative location of the executable where it should be located.
Right. So this is a very clear indicators of process hollowing, right? Because not only do we have unmapped paths, but we do see that, as you're pointing out, this one should actually be a reference to the executable. So essentially, the area where the executable was located is still there. It's being tracked, but it's been somehow bulldozed, right? So what you would have is, does anybody have an idea of another indicator that, like, let's just say a sysadmin would expect to see in this kind of, for this one specifically, for lsas.exe right here, having been attacked through process hollowing? Does anybody, like, what else would I expect to see in my list of running processes?
Oh, well, you briefly mentioned this earlier, very quickly, so I don't expect everybody caught it, but I'm going to take a stab and say, well, I know that processes have handles to all things that they are interacting with, right?
Okay.
And so there's a potential that if something has tampered with LSS, as we can see evidence here, that another process may have a handle on this process. Possibly.
Okay, so another idea would be, and by the way, I don't know if you said it like this, or if I just heard it, but I just realized for the first time this could also be lsdonkey.exe. But anyways, so if I look for a list of running processes, one of the things I would expect to see is multiple instances of lsas.exe. That's, so you're right, but also an easier sort of mechanism would be, if I had multiple instances of lsas.exe, that would be a very clear indicator that something's wrong, because I know that I should only have one instance of lsas.exe. Most people would know that I could look at I could look at them and try to interrogate the process to see where did it get loaded from. But it's going to be a little difficult because those processes are going to look somewhat the same at a first glance, right? Like, this is a legitimate shell of lsas.exe. It's not until I get in here and I start seeing things like this with like an unmapped path that I can determine that one of them's false and one of them's actually the legit one. So I know we're getting close to being out of time here. So I'll stop sharing. I want to throw a couple of links in there, but I'll leave it to you or anybody else who wants to kind of jump in really quick.
Are you asking about if I looked at other processes, as in like if I were also looking at parent processes?
I was actually just saying if I listed out all my running processes, period, then I would see multiple instances of lsas.exe.
Oh, okay. I thought you were saying that if you were to look at like parent processes and you saw one that wasn't winning it, that you'd be like, "What's that about?"
Especially correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm on the spot, but I'm pretty sure these would have the same parent. It would have the legitimate parent process, right? Because it's the legitimate lsas.exe process being started.
Right, because to tamper, because they're not necessarily launching it in a suspicious way. It was already launched. It was already launched through the correct sort of ancestry, right? So the correct parent and grandparent, all that stuff are there. It was just then tampered with after the fact that it was launched. However, side note, there's other tampering techniques that can then go in and play with that parent process information as well. But that's a topic for another day.
Oh, I thought we were doing process hollowing, and if you launched it, it would probably show Explore, right? Or whatever process was actually used to launch.
It just depends on how it was launched,
That's
though, because
fair.
you're assuming you're hollowing a newly launched process that you launched. But what if you're hollowing an existing process that's been running for some time?
Oh, okay.
But that's fair, Ryan, because there's different ways to launch a process essentially, right?
Because in the Stuxnet example he just had, that was hollowing out LSAS. The user, the threat actor didn't launch LSAS in order to hollow it. It was running. It was already back there, right? And that was a cool example to show, Marcus.
Hey, I'm stealing how you call it LSAS as opposed to LSAS. That's wonderful.
All right, folks. Well, that really perfectly closes out here at the top of the hour. Marcus, that was phenomenal. Thank you so much. I know there were some folks in chat asking if you'd be willing to share that diagram. If you are, okay, if you are, just drop it into the Lima Charlie Slack. That's where, we've got the Defender Fridays channel. For anybody not in the Slack, I dropped a link in chat, right? But just slack.limacharlie.io. There is a Defender Fridays channel where you can get these cool resources. And also, that's how you got to know if you win the Defender Fridays shirt that we give out once a week to a random participant. So join the Slack, hang out with us all. And otherwise, we will see you all same time, same place next week. Have an awesome long weekend, everybody. Take some downtime, spend some time with friends, family, or hobbies, whatever makes you happy. And we'll see you next week. Thanks again, Marcus.
See you guys.